Welcome everybody to the second session in our Lenten studies, and this week we are going to look specifically at New Testament understandings of hospitality, and of course with me today is Nikki. So together we're going to look at this. Let's begin by reading Matthew chapter 8, verses 1 to 4. When Jesus had come down from the mountain, great crowds followed him. And there was a leper who came to him and knelt before him, saying, "Lord, if you choose, you can make me clean." He stretched out his hand and touched him, saying, "I do choose, be made clean." Immediately his leprosy was cleansed. Then Jesus said to him, "See that you say nothing to anyone, but go, show yourself to the priest, and offer the gift that Moses commanded as a testimony." As we listen to this passage, or as you read it for yourself, what strikes you about this passage? Take a moment to jot down or share your feelings and thoughts. I like this story. It's very short. And it's very, very powerful. And I like the action of Jesus in this story and the way in which he does this healing, in fact. Any thoughts on your side, Nikki?
For me, it would be what strikes me in this passage is, "Lord, if you choose, you can make me clean." And that's saying, I do choose. The power of choice. So you have the choice to do good or not, to be hospitable or not to be. So that brings that to my mind. What do I choose in a certain situation, to do good or not?
The psychologist Richard Beck, who we will be introduced to a little later, asks us to note the order in which the events take place in the story. Jesus first touches the leper, and then he says, "Be clean." Jesus first makes himself ritually unclean, and then he heals. Jesus allows himself, in other words, to be defiled and become unclean before he makes somebody else clean, before he heals him. This is an incredible act of solidarity, of identifying with those who are considered unclean or excluded or marginalized. Once Jesus has identified in this way, he then purifies or heals. This is the opposite way around the way in which Jewish laws of purity were to be practiced. These focused then first on a sense of exclusion, then healing, then purification and inclusion. In order to understand, I think, just how radical this action was, and of course we do know that Jesus repeatedly made himself unclean in many of his healing miracles, I ask you now to read the story, because of here what we have done is we have sanitized our gospel stories by telling them too frequently and therefore not dwelling on them and the real emotion and action connected with them. Mary Douglas tells this story about St. Catherine of Siena, patron saint of the Italians. She writes, "When she, that is Catherine, felt revulsion from the wounds she was tending, she bitterly reproached herself. Sound hygiene was incompatible with charity, so she deliberately drank a bowl of pus." Now, I should ask you to stay with the vivid image, and hopefully it does evoke a vivid image for you and your emotions as you read this story. And then take a moment to share them or write them down. So, Nikki and I have both had the advantage of actually reading this material before, and me of writing this material before. But no matter how often I read it, I find that this story forces us to face up to what is regarded as disgusting and contaminating. And if you're anything like me, you'll find it uncomfortable or unsettling, very disturbing, in fact. I see Nikki nodding in assent as we look at these things. Of course, if you are very squeamish, you won't have enjoyed the story at all, and you would wonder how on earth I can do a Bible study putting the story in. Well, if these are the emotions you are actually dealing with, then you should be able to identify fully with the story of the leper and Jesus' healing of the leper. In a very intriguing book entitled Unclean, Meditations on Purity, Hospitality, and Mortality, Richard Beck says that the psychology of disgust and contamination regulates how many Christians reason with and experience notions of holiness, atonement, and sin. Of course, these are all very important words for us in this Lenten period. And he also says that they then regulate the social boundaries and notions of hospitality that exist within the church. I've often wondered that if Jesus came into the church and we smelt him, because he wouldn't have smelt like we are, he didn't wash except for ritual cleansing like we do in Palestine, and Jesus was not a Roman and nor Greek, he was Jewish. Whether we would just, as he sat down in the pew, shift to the end of the pew as he sat down, so that we could move ourselves as far away from this smelly man as possible. Beck invites us to think about Matthew chapter 9, verses 9 to 13, and this tension that we find in the scriptures between sacrifice and mercy. You can read it for yourself. As Jesus was walking along, he saw a man called Matthew sitting at the tax booth, and he said to him, "Follow me." And he got up and followed him. And as he sat at dinner in the house, many tax collectors and sinners came and were sitting with him and his disciples. When the Pharisees saw this, they said to his disciples, "Why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners?" But when he heard this, he said, "Those who are well have no need for a physician, but those who are sick. Go learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice, for I have come to call not the righteous, but sinners." Beck, who has a background and is a psychologist, writes, "How are we to draw the boundaries of exclusion and inclusion in the life of the church? Sacrifice, that purity impulse, marks off a zone of holiness, admitting the clean and expelling the unclean. Mercy, by contrast, crosses those purity boundaries. Mercy blurs the distinction, bringing clean and unclean into contact. So with this in mind, I'm going to hand over now to Nikki, and we're going to look at some of the New Testament words and ideas for hospitality. But first, let me introduce the broad variety of them. People note the following words are used when discussing hospitality. Xenos, meaning foreigner, stranger, guest. Xenia, hospitality or a guest room. Xenizo, to surprise or entertain. Xenodokia, to show hospitality. Philoxenia, hospitality. And philoxenos, host. It all concentrates mostly on the word philoxenia and xenos, so let us therefore quickly deal with the other words. The words xenizo in the New Testament means to surprise or to be strange, and you'll find that word used in Acts chapter 17 verse 20 and also 1 Peter chapter 4 verse 4. But it also means to entertain, and you'll find that in Acts chapter 10, verse 23, and Hebrews 3, verse 2. As the emphasis in Kittel and other reference works is then on the words xenos and philoxenia, we will then concentrate on these two words.
Thank you, Doug. Xenos. In its commentary on the attitude of Christians to foreigners, Kittel notes that Christians share the dislike of the Old Testament and Judaism for what is foreign in religion. Richard Beck points out that what was foreign was regarded as a possible source of defilement, so that a distinction is made between the church and the world. With the encouragement, according to James chapter 1, verse 27, to keep oneself from being polluted by the world. In contrast to this notion of what is foreign or Gentile, read Acts chapter 10, verse 9 to 23. About noon the next day, as they were on their journey and approaching the city, Peter went up on the roof to pray. He became hungry and wanted something to eat. And while it was being prepared, he fell into a trance. He saw the heaven opened and something like a large sheet coming down, being lowered to the ground by its four corners. In it were all kinds of four-footed creatures and reptiles and birds of the air. Then he heard a voice saying, "Get up, Peter, kill and eat." But Peter said, "By no means, Lord, for I have never eaten anything that is profane or unclean." The voice said to him again, a second time, "What God has made clean, you must not call profane." This happened 3 times, and the thing was suddenly taken up to heaven. Now while Peter was greatly puzzled about what to make of the vision that he had seen, suddenly the man sent by Cornelius appeared. They were asking for Simon's house and were standing by the gate. They called out to ask whether Simon, who was called Peter, was staying there. While Peter was still thinking about the vision, the Spirit said to him, "Look, 3 men are searching for you. Now get up, go down and go with them without hesitation, for I have sent them." So Peter went down to the men and said, "I am the one you are looking for. What is the reason for your coming?" They answered, "Cornelius, a centurion, an upright and God-fearing man, who is well spoken of by the whole Jewish nation, was directed by a holy angel to send for you to come to his house and to hear what you have to say." So Peter invited them in and gave them lodging. The next day he got up and went with them, and some of the believers from Joppa accompanied him. What do you think we should do about this tension? Take a moment or two to think about this, then discuss it or write down your response. That's a tension indeed. But sit with it. And meditate upon it. And then write about it and share it with one another. Well, certainly Doug and I will have to do that on another time. Well, Beck writes, disgust properties are frequently imputed to despised groups. We also see it in Peter's vision of unclean animals in Acts chapter 10. The vision is ostensibly about the Jewish purity codes regarding foodstuffs. But the heart of the vision is sociological. The critique that the Jewish leaders of the church were not taking the gospel to the Gentiles. In short, disgust properties create sociological barriers and motivate acts of exclusion. In mild forms, this exclusion is simply avoidance or contempt. In extreme forms, the act of exclusion is genocidal. In the commentary Kittel makes on Xenos, its authors point out that the love of Xenos is a special form of love of neighbor, as Jesus shows in the parable of the Good Samaritan and in the parable of judgment in Matthew chapter 25. Showing kindness to strangers and receiving a heavenly reward was not new in religious thinking, but it is given a new twist in Matthew chapter 25, verse 35 to 40. Here Kittel points out it is Jesus who is the Xenos. And so how one responds to the stranger is how one responds to Jesus. The stranger representing Jesus might of course be anyone, and not just some other Christian. Thus, all the ethical concepts of humanity regarding kindness to strangers come to fulfillment here. In the most alien of aliens, Jesus himself is loved. Strange people, strange bodies. Beck in his book has a chapter that focuses on mortality. He says that corpses, blood fluids, and deformity trigger disgust because they remind us of death. The physical body has often been regarded with suspicion, mistrust, or disgust within Christian tradition. Our inability to deal with mortality is particularly evident as we live with COVID at present. We are afraid of contracting the COVID, so we avoid others. COVID brings to the surface something that has been at the heart of American thinking for a long time, and thus has impacted all of us in our own thinking and theology. Beck writes this: as Arthur C. McGill observes in his book Death and Life, in American theology, Americans devote themselves to expunging from their lives every appearance, every intimation of death, all traces of weaknesses, debility, ugliness, and helplessness must be kept away from every part of a person's life. In order then to pretend that death and decay is not at work, we have built up powerful advertising agencies, and worse still, according to Beck, we hide our eyes from the old, sick, deformed, ugly, and needy. Fear drives us into isolation. Disgust motivates us to avoid and push away reminders of vulnerability and death in both others and ourselves. The antidote to this is a church willing to embrace need, decay, and vulnerability. It is a church that is willing to find the Christ in the other. So then, take a moment to think about this, then quickly write down and share one idea of how you think the church can find Christ in the other in a time of COVID. Well, I would say for me, an act of kindness, showing love in a time of COVID, an act of forgiveness in a time of COVID.
Sometimes it's just about hearing the voice of the other and being available to be a listening ear. Listen to people's life experience. Share with them in their senses of loss and isolation and frustration and strangeness. Philoxenia, the other Greek word, The idea of hospitality is one deeply grounded in the practice of the early church in the New Testament. Hebrews 13:2. Do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers, for by doing that some have entertained angels without knowing it. This sees hospitality as a characteristic of the church, and in fact makes implied reference to the experience of Abraham, which we looked at in our last session. Romans chapter 12:13 instructs churches to practice hospitality, and 1 Timothy chapter 3:2 requires this of leaders in the church. Koenig says that philoxein, the term for hospitality in the New Testament, refers literally not to a love of a stranger, but to delight in the whole guest-host relationship, in the mysterious reversals and gains for all parties that take place. That requires something of a thunk, I would have thought, because it takes us beyond just, how can I help you? Hospitality was not only necessary for traveling preachers, time of Jesus and in the early church. It wasn't also just necessary for teachers and leaders, but was also based on the direct experiences and direct experience of early disciples themselves. Jesus himself had no home, so he was dependent on the hospitality of others. Mark chapter 1, verses 29 following, and 2, chapter 15 following, tell us this. He was dependent on the hospitality of a group of women disciples who provided for him, as well as those like Martha, Mary, and Lazarus, who hosted him. Paul also enjoyed the hospitality of many homes as he spread the gospel. So hospitality is part of the inbuilt DNA of the Christian community, or at least it's meant to be part of that inbuilt DNA. Strangers and aliens in the world. Another important way in which being foreign and foreignness is thought about in the New Testament is the idea of being strangers and aliens. Ephesians 2:19 reads, "So then you are no longer strangers and aliens, but you are citizens with the saints and also members of the household of God." This text must be read as part of the whole of Ephesians chapter 2 to be fully understood and properly understood. In this regard, it is once again worth noting what Kittel has to say. The world belongs to God, but has been estranged from him by an alien power, so that the antithesis of humanity is not the world. Antithesis of humanity is not with the world, but with God. God's action, whether in grace or judgment, is alien to us. Israel, however, has been put in God's land as a resident alien under his protection, and as such, keeping God's law, she becomes a foreign body in the world of humanity. Of course, in the New Testament, the idea of Israel is then taken over, and the church sees itself as the new Israel. The idea of God being other and thus foreign or strange to the world has implications for how Christians are to regard otherness, both that of God and people, and even of their own otherness. Steve Boehmer Prediger writes, "We are neither well-ensconced home dwellers, safe and secure in our fortresses of sameness, nor are we nomads perpetually peripatetic on the road heading nowhere. We are neither eternal dwellers nor eternal wanderers, but Christ-following sojourners at home on the way, traveling with others as people of memory, community, and hospitality." We will explore this further when we explore radical hospitality. For the moment, it is sufficient to note that in the New Testament, Christ comes to the world as a stranger. Mark chapter 12, verse 1 following, and John chapter 1, verse 10 to 13, and then chapter 8, 25 following, and 21, 12. And Jesus is subject to misunderstanding. For this reason, his disciples will also be misunderstood, and they will be regarded as aliens in the world. Read John chapter 15, verse 9, 17, verses 14 to 16. On account of this, Christians are to show hospitality not just to the household of God, but to all who are strangers. I'm going to hand over to Nikki, and we're going to take a little while with this next thing because it is an exercise in prayer. Make yourself comfortable.
Okay, let's get comfortable.
And let me hand over to Nikki.
Thank you, Doug. Earlier in this session, we spoke about our fear of our own mortality. Here is a prayer exercise that can help us deal with that fear and become more hospitable to those who are different from us. Saying goodbye to your body. Imagine now that you have said your final farewells to everyone, and you have just about an hour or two of life left. You have reserved this time for yourself and for God. Begin by speaking to your body. Talk to each limb, your hands, your feet, your heart, your brain, your lungs, bidding each goodbye. You must be paying explicit attention to some of them for the very first time in your life, now that you are about to die. Love each one of your limbs. Take your right hand, for instance. Thank it for all the service it has given you. Give it all your love and gratitude, now that it is soon going to turn into dust. Do this for each of the other limbs and organs of your body. Then your body as a whole, with its special form and appearance and color and height and features. Now imagine that you see Jesus near you. Listen to him. Thank each of the members of your body for the service it has given you in life. See him fill the whole of your body with his love and gratitude. Then hear him saying to you,
this is, of course, an exercise which you can do. We are doing it fairly quickly, but as you heard, it asks you to place yourself in an imaginative space, asks you to place yourself in a quiet place where you've got some time as you're able to dwell on every single part of your body and then listen to Jesus speak to you. And it's a valuable exercise because some people really don't like their bodies very much, or they don't like one or other aspect of their bodies, and this is an opportunity for you to actually deal with that part of your body that you don't like, so that you can have a healthy love and acceptance for the whole of yourself, without which it's impossible to give ourselves fully to loving God and to others. And that's why Anthony de Mello wrote this rather beautiful meditation for us. So I do hope you will take time to this, and I hope you will actually wrangle a little bit more. Think about, discuss with others this concept of of hospitality that we find in the New Testament. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you.